The time is just gone, 8:31 a.m. as we continue with the broadcast right here on Salam Media on News and Views this morning. And we are now going to be focusing on Sudan. Now, the reason why we are focusing on Sudan is the question that is being raised is there any chance for peace in Sudan? And there was an interesting article that came up in the Middle East Monitor by Shafi Kader Said. And he speaks about Marina Peter, a German expert on intercultural education and a teacher of German language and history, who did not know much about Sudan. And when she visited Sudan, she prepared or presented a paper which is titled Possibilities for Peace in Sudan. And in this piece, she talks about Sudan, about her first encounters with the people of Sudan back in 1986. And she's saying 40 years later, the situation has got worse. And she also talks about the famine in 1983, but she talks about Sharia laws, the human rights abuses, and also just looking at the war for survival and to unpack all of this and to understand whether we agree or whether we don't agree with what Marina Peters, and I'm sure Aisha Keji, who is my guest this morning, she is an analyst, she's an activist and a writer, will unpack some of these issues that have been playing out. So we're going across to be joined by Aisha Keji. Aisha, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me on the show, Inayat.
Yes, Aisha, when we're talking about Sudan, it's quite interesting. And I'm just looking at this article talking about prospects for peace in Sudan and people who visit Sudan, like Marina Peters. Obviously, they've got their own analysis and assessment of the situation. They draw their own conclusion. And we know that we can't agree with everything what people say because they look at things differently. Just your analysis on how you see what has been playing out in Sudan.
Well, what has been playing out in Sudan recently, the scene for that was set a long, long time ago. With a country with such rich resources that has been subject to so many coups d'etat over the last few decades, and then the stranglehold of power by Umar al-Bashir for many decades as well, where the elites got richer at the expense of the disenfranchisement and dispossession of those at the margins. Sudan is a huge country, the largest, or previously one of the largest in Africa before the breakaway of Southern Sudan and the independence of Southern Sudan. And it's a country, as I said, very richly blessed with natural resources, particularly oil, gold, cobalt, coltan, cotton, and even things like gum arabic, which is an essential component of all soft drinks, believe it or not. So it's a very, very blessed country in terms of its natural resources. This, of course, has made it a battleground not only for factions within Sudan, but also for regional and international players. And I've written extensively about this in the past, specifically concerning the Darfur conflict in the early and mid 2000s. So the same conditions still apply in Sudan, and it's why there has been a repeated lack of failure at brokering a ceasefire since conflict escalated in April this year, or since, as some people say, conflict broke out. I would say that there was always some conflict present in the country, but that conflict escalated in April of this year, on the 15th of April. And that conflict has largely been as major disagreements arose between the leader of Sudan's military and the leader of the Rapid Security Forces, the RSF, which were previously a kind of, militia group run by a renegade who was also implicated in war crimes in Darfur, Mohammed Dagalo, popularly known as Hemedti. This is someone I've met in the past. This is someone who is not a peacemaker, but rather a warmonger. But the same can be said of the Sudanese army itself. They were under the command of Umar al-Bashir when he was still head of government, but they're certainly supportive of those economic and political elites that controlled Sudan for so many decades. So if a real peace is to be negotiated in Sudan, it has to include more than just these two factions. It has to include the various civil society actors in the country, who initially at least provoked Bashir's unseating. And they have largely been sidelined, they've been ignored. Even the international community and regional players have said to them, you need to come together under one banner. This is just not possible. There are various civil society groupings in Sudan, as they are in any country. And to actually insult them by saying, make one united civil society grouping is not a possibility right now. They each have their own interests and they each deserve a voice in the future of Sudan. That's the first thing I'd like to say. I'd also like to say that Sudan could be heading for major chaos if there isn't a resolution of the current conflict fairly soon. The reasons for that are manifold, but largely because there is an increasing problem of internally displaced people. There are now over 4 million people displaced internally, and over 1 million people who have left the country just since April. Altogether, Sudan has about 7 million displaced people, including those refugees outside the country and the internal refugees. That is a huge problem, with many going hungry, many struggling for survival, etc. Secondly, the environmental factors in Sudan lead me to think that perhaps a famine is coming, because not just to Sudan, but to other parts of Central and Northern Africa as well. Given the El Nino phenomenon, the possibilities of drought in the next year are extremely high. And if that happens, the current suffering of Sudanese people will be exacerbated. And Sudanese people are amongst my favorite people anywhere in the world. They do not deserve to suffer in this way. Unfortunately, they are vulnerable to the tactics of greedy political and economic elites. Thirdly, another factor that could exacerbate this conflict is the current breakout of fighting in West Darfur, specifically since the Jenaina attacks a couple of months ago. And that needs to be sorted out very, very quickly. There is and always has been a proliferation of small arms in this region since the Cold War began, and even after the end of the Cold War. You can walk into a marketplace in some areas in Sudan and Chad and see small arms for sale next to piles of tomatoes. I have seen this. So it is an extremely volatile situation, and one that needs serious attempts at negotiation towards peace, disarmament, and a civilian administration. And we said this when Bashir was unseated. We said it was not a good idea to have the army in charge, and that it would be very difficult to persuade the army to hand over to civilian administration after the set period. And as we saw, that's exactly what played out. The civilians were sidelined. The army has kept a chokehold on power together with the RSF. And now there's been this conflict between the army and the RSF. And of course, the winners are not the ordinary people of Sudan. They are the victims of this conflict.
Yes, and also, Aisha, when one looks at the assessment by someone like Marina Peters, talking about the war has increasingly become one of a tribal nature. And they talk about the introduction of Sharia law, and against what you've been saying, and you're speaking about the RSF. And we know there are many external factors. These are not only internal dynamics that are playing out in Sudan, and simply put, the war becoming one of a tribal nature, because we know with the RSF, there are externals. There are soldiers from Chad, from Mali, from Niger, from Libya, all of this. And they want this fight to continue, because this is where they are making their money from. This is making money out of war. And as a result, we see all this disregard for law and all the human rights abuses that are taking place.
Yes, absolutely. The fighters, not only from the surrounding countries like Chad, etc., who are mercenaries paid by the RSF, amongst others, but also fighters from within Sudan are also paid to fight. Hemeti's family, for example, controls many of the gold mines in the Darfur region. and so is able to pay these fighters. And it is in the fighters' best interests to carry on fighting, as you've said. However, the tribal and ethnic nature of this conflict in Sudan, once again, is not something new. It has long roots, and it has roots in the conflict in Darfur in 2003, but also further back. The conflict dates to um, the way of life, the mode of life of those so-called Arabs in the region who were traditionally nomadic and were cattle herders, versus the more settled agrarian population who were regarded as non-Arab. Not so much because of their physiognomy, because they didn't look Arab or didn't speak Arabic. Nearly everyone in Sudan speaks some form of Arabic. So it's not about ethnicity in the way we categorize ethnicity, in the way people look, or what seems to be their ancestry. But traditionally, in those regions of Sudan, ethnicity was very fluid, and you could become Arab or non-Arab, for example, or Zigawa, purely by changing your mode of life. And there were intermarriages between these so-called ethnic groupings. But of course, when resources were discovered in Sudan, and there was a conflict over the utilization of those resources, then the ethnic identities were manipulated so that they became a factor in the conflict, and that sides were taken between one or the other, including sides being taken by neighboring countries and their governments. Remember that, if you live on the border of Chad and Sudan in West Darfur, for example, you have family on either side of the border. And there's intermarriage, there's social relations on both sides of the border. So those kind of ethnic or tribal identities, family, community identities, if you will, are very strong. And that is what was being exploited, both in the conflict in Darfur in the early to mid 2000s and in the current conflict. That is what led, to some extent at least, to the rise of the rapid support forces. They rose out of the then so-called Janjaweed, which was supported by the Bashir government, by the Sudanese army, albeit covertly. And really, this conflict is about much more than ethnic identity, but that ethnic and tribal identity has been manipulated. On the question of Sharia law, the Bashir government had imposed its own rather strange version of Sharia law, which was particularly resented by people in South Sudan and was a huge factor in the breakout of hostilities between North and South Sudan. Now that South Sudan is independent, that is not so much a factor, because the majority of people in what is now Sudan are Muslim. So the issue of Sharia law, the imposition of alcohol bans, etc., is not so much an issue. However, what has been an issue is the patriarchy resulting from certain forms of Sharia law and the concomitant gender-based violence. The United Nations has recently put out a circular showing that there's been a spike, a sharp escalation in the amount of rapes, abuses of women, just who are going to find water or going to tend fields, etc., in the regions where the conflict is currently rife. And this is of significant concern, and also in the refugee camps and the internally displaced people's camps.
Well, Aisha, just finally, quickly, a ceasefire. What will it take to have a ceasefire and peace in the region?
There have been many attempts recently by various actors, including Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, the United States, to broker a ceasefire. None of these has lasted past 24 hours, I think, although some of them have allowed for a little humanitarian aid to filter through. At Eid al-Adha recently, not so long ago, both sides announced a ceasefire, but neither side kept to it. It was during that time, however, that several hundred children, for example, at an orphanage in the capital, or in the sister city to the capital, Omdurman, were able to be actually taken out of the city to a safer place. So there have been some merits to even these partial ceasefires. But to broker a real ceasefire needs to really, impose severer sanctions, not just economic sanctions, but sanctions generally for breaking those ceasefires. And both the regional actors and the international actors need to come to the table with those and need to include, once again, I must emphasize this, the various civilian groups who are really Sudan's best hope for a lasting peace.
Well, Aisha, Jazakallah khairan so much for that. And as always, your time with us right here on Salam Media. All the best to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Shukran jazilan for having me on. My apologies for being a little bit nasal. I have the flu at the moment.
That's fine. It didn't show up, but as always, we appreciate your time. Aisha Keji with us this morning, right here on Salam Media. We're heading for our weekly edition of Crime Talk this morning, and we'll be back after this break.